Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, and welcome to this Friends of Multilateralism Group (FMG) session on the trade policy preview on Mexico. And most of you already know the purpose of this initiative is actually we organize this kind of sessions sometime in advance of the normal trade policy review of the WTO, so as to give, ambassadors, experts, and also organization representatives kind of informal and more candidate framework to discuss some aspects on the trade policy of the member on the review and Mexico. That's for today. So very much thanks for all of you for coming. And I particularly thank our FMG member, Clemens, for leading this initiative. He has put a lot of efforts in getting all the excellent speakers together today, and all the kind of questions and things we are going to discuss is excellent. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Clem and listen. Look forward to a fruitful discussion today. Clem, please. Thank you very much.
Lou, thank you very much indeed, and thank you also for the introduction. I think one or two things that I'd like to mention. One is that we run these somewhat in sync with the scheduled trade policy reviews of the countries in the WTO, but we do not, and I think it's important to note this, we do not have access to the WTO documents. And I'm rather glad about that. It gives us, our speakers, I think, a fresh perspective and perhaps adds something to the discussion that will follow later in the WTO itself. I certainly hope so. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that the focus in these exercises in our trade policy previews is on the country, but it is also on the system itself, on the multilateral system. It looks at how the country fits into the multilateral system, what the country contributes to the multilateral system, and vice versa, what the multilateral system is able to do for the country and how it serves the country's interests and benefits the country. So the multilateral system is very much part of this discussion. And that is what that's what FMG tries to do. It concentrates on aspects of the multilateral system. We have today with us, I think, three excellent speakers. Simon is going to lead us off. He's going to give us, he's going to use information that he has superbly collected from the global trade, from his what do you call yourself? GTA, Simon. From his own database. He has been very generous. He's let us see the slides in advance. It's a superb pack that he has performed. We are then going to be followed by Professor Fernando, former ambassador to the WTO for Mexico, and then by Bradley Condon, who is the WTO Chair at ITAM in Mexico. That is somewhat of an innovation that we're doing in these exercises, and I'll come to it a little bit more when I actually introduce Bradley later on. But without any further waiting, I'd like now to give the floor to Simon. And Simon, you have 15, 20 minutes, as much as you need. It's yours.
Thank you, Clement. Thank you, Clement. Thank you for the opportunity to share a factual overview on Mexico's trade policy stance and on its stake in the world trading system. I am going to share some slides, which the organizers tell us will be posted as well later. So let me bring those slides up now. Hopefully you can see them. If you cannot, please shout. So this briefing is based on data from the Global Trade Alert database, which is a substantial database of unilateral trade policy actions taken by countries around the world since November 2008. My focus here will be on the unilateral policy actions of Mexico. This is not to deny the importance of the many regional trading agreements which Mexico has signed, and of course the important coming into effect of the USMCA on the 1st of July 2020. The presentation is broken down into examining the development context of Mexico to put further the discussion on trade policy in context. Then I will turn to the current state of affairs of Mexico's trade policy, then the changes since the last TPR, and then finally Mexico's stake in the system. I will not draw broad brush conclusions from this presentation. Instead, I will offer some questions which may be taken up in discussion. So let's provide the development context of Mexico. I have a few slides here. The first is, as far as the growth trajectory is concerned, since the last TPR, essentially the Mexican economy has stagnated in terms of GDP and GDP per capita. However, the labor market outcomes have been quite promising. We've seen rapid real wage growth and a very low unemployment rate. When it comes to other important development dimensions such as carbon dioxide emissions and gender gaps, the record, I'm afraid, is not so good. Turning to
Sorry, Simon, yes. You're still on the same slide, the first slide.
Okay.
No.
I'm sorry about that.
He's right, Simon. The slides are not moving.
No.
Okay. Well, we try again. So, can you see those other slides moving now?
Yeah, it's setting the scene is now on screen.
Okay, then very good. So the first slide, this first setting the scene slide, was about Mexico's GDP and other trajectories, which I've discussed. The second slide on the trajectory is the trade volumes. Can you see this now? Hello?
No, I can't see it.
Okay, it's not.
I can see it.
I see it. Trade flows.
I saw
It's on the screen, setting the scene.
Yeah,
setting the scene, trade flows is on the screen.
Yes.
Great, okay. So when we come to the trade flows, we see a very sort of mixed performance, rising fast growth in goods trade, not so fast growth in services trade. We see quite heavy concentration of export destinations, but this has gone down since the last trade policy review from 80% concentration in the United States to 76%. The services imports and exports are much more diversified. I turn now to the next slide, which enables us to talk a little bit more about trade policy. In order to build a picture of Mexico's trade policy stance, we have to take advantage of the information that's been recorded either at the WTO or found on Mexican government policy websites. I'm sorry? Let me carry on. So essentially, in the WTO's trade monitoring database, there are 200 recorded measures. The Global Trade Alert database has 415.
Sorry to interrupt, Simon, but your slides are, at least in my screen, they are frozen. We are in setting.
Are you on slide number 5?
No, we're not, Simon. We're still on setting the scene and trade flows. Your slides are not in presentation mode, and that may be a problem.
Okay.
I think when you share the screen, you should click the share on the top right again.
Yeah.
To make. I think that's probably you have not done.
I'm afraid I don't understand what you're saying. The shares, this shares thing is.
Yeah.
Oh.
Simon's on a brand new computer.
Yeah, that's.
This is okay. I'm afraid then I do not know how to do this.
Okay, don't worry, you just carry on. I will ask Natalie to put it on the screen now, so she could read on her screen.
Actually, if Natalie does that, I will then just go through, okay? So if Natalie could load it up to slide number 5, that would be fantastic.
Natalie, can you do that?
I didn't receive the
Okay, I'll pass it to you.
PowerPoint.
Yeah, Simon, could you carry on? I will pass it to Natalie. So yeah.
Will you pass them on, Lou?
Yeah. Okay, I'll do it now.
Okay, I apologize, colleagues, for this slight snafu. So, in order to build a picture of the Mexican trade policy situation, we have to draw from available trade policy information. There are 200 measures in the trade policy monitoring database of the WTO. We have found another 215 in the Global Trade Alert of website, government websites in Mexico. This provides a total information source of about 415 measures. And the question then is, how does that stack up to other G20 countries? If you take the total number of measures in the Global Trade Alert database and divide it by the total amount of trade and compare across the G20, then it turns out that Mexico has the lowest amount of information available, which then leads, I think, to the first question that I will ask later, which is what is the, are we satisfied with the amount of information that's available on Mexico's commercial policies, and what steps could be taken to enhance that? So that would be the first one. I would then move on to slides number 6 and 7. I hope Natalie can raise them soon. In those slides, I will turn now to the current trade policy stance of Mexico. As of the 13th of September 2022, we have 257 trade policy measures which are in effect by Mexico, 2/3 of which, 69% of which discriminate against foreign commercial interests. And most of those discriminatory measures are anti-dumping measures and or trade distorting subsidies and some import tariff increases. On the liberalizing side, and it's important to balance the discussion, there are numerous import tariff reductions which have been implemented. So this is, I think, the key point to say in terms of the current levels of intervention. Then when we turn to, and I'm glad you've got the slides up, let's turn to slide number 8, please, the next slide. We can see that the sectors which have been affected by Mexican trade distortions have changed since the last TPR. Protection of imports protection from steel and iron imports have gone down, and so for fabricated metals. However, we do see more protection of textiles and of clothing, and more greater protection of the petroleum sector as well. So there is a shift since the last TPR in the sectors which have been affected by discriminatory measures. If we can move forward to the next slide. I have data on the estimated export coverage from Mexico's trading partners, and as they face trade impediments in the Mexican market, the countries listed here are the ones where 75% or more of their exports face some type of current trade distortion in the Mexican market. And when you look across the countries here, they're all developing countries. I'll come back to that point more explicitly. And there are some countries such as Egypt and Ukraine, which have seen a substantial increase in barriers in the Mexican market since the last TPR. If we move on to slide 10, we balance that discussion by looking at the countries where they currently enjoy improvements in market access compared to when we started our monitoring. And you can see there's a vast number of countries which have benefited from unilateral measures by Mexico, which are currently in force. And so this, I think, balances out the discussion and highlights here that there are a number of both developing and industrialized countries which have benefited from liberalizing measures by Mexico. So the picture is quite a mixed one of both greater interventions on the harmful and the liberalizing side. If we can move on to slide 11, I'll turn now from the trade regime to the investment regime. A key feature of the Mexican investment regime is that it has a reporting requirement for transactions above a certain threshold. Those thresholds in nominal terms have increased over time. However, once you correct for inflation, then since 2017, the real value of that reporting threshold has been constant, which suggests then that the regime has not become more generous in real terms. So the investment regime seems to have gone sideways. I should add, as you're interpreting the trade policy and investment policy measures of Mexico, please note that there was a change in presidential administration in 2018. So the first snapshot then was of where Mexico is at the moment. The next section of the presentation from slide 12 onwards turns to look at developments since the last TPR. So if we can go to slide 13, please, which is the next one, we will see the market access improvements that have built up since the 1st of January 2017. And we can see that in total, the market access improvements cover 6% of Mexico's imports, and we see liberalization in the licensing regimes and tariff reductions as the biggest drivers of the improved market access. Balancing that discussion on reform with trade distortions is done on slide 14, please. And on slide 14, we can see that since the beginning of 2017, there has been an increase in the number of measures or the amount of trade facing trade distortions, and in fact around 12 or 13% of Mexico's imports now face trade distortions, which were not present at the beginning of 2017. Most of the action is in 3 areas: licensing regimes, import licensing regimes, subsidies, and tariff increases. So these are the 3 policy areas where there's been the most action. If we go to slide number 15, we have an important finding which surprised me. I had not expected this. What we did was to break down the exposure of different trading partners to the policy changes which have been put in place since the 1st of January 2017. The first split we did was between countries which have RTAs and don't have RTAs with Mexico. That doesn't seem to make too much difference. The most outstanding finding is that for some reason, and I don't understand why, and maybe our Mexican colleagues can help, from 2018 onwards, we see trade policy interventions that cover almost all the imports from the least developed countries. So harmful policy intervention seems to have disproportionately covered the LDC exports to Mexico. Notice I've stated that very carefully. I've not said that Mexico has targeted the LDCs, but I have argued that this seems that the outcome has been somewhat uneven across Mexico's trading partners. So I think that's a finding we'll come back to as well. If you go to slide number 16, please, you can break out which of these sectors from the LDCs face the most trade impediments, and you can see that in terms of harmful interventions, the clothing sectors and minerals and fuels are the sectors which are being hit the most. So somehow the incidence of Mexican trade distortions has been on sectors where the LDCs are particularly well represented. So if we can go forward now to slide number 17, we have examples of the types of interventions that Mexico has put in place. Here that we have a mix of subsidies, reference prices are a tool which Mexico uses to control its tariffs, as well as outright tariff increases are found in the Mexican record since the last TPR. If we go to the next slide, we balance that with examples of liberalizing measures, and again, most of these are in the area of tariffs. So what I have done in this second substantive section is to try and give you a sense of how policy has changed since the last TPR, and you can see that there have been some quite significant changes. The last factual part I'll provide to the presentation is to highlight Mexico's stake in the non-discriminatory world trading system. And here, if we go to the next slide, please, we will see that Mexico's exports face a large number of trade distortions in foreign markets. The pattern which we have here for Mexico is very standard across the larger trading nations. That is anything between 75 to 100% of exports facing some type of trade distortion, and most of the action being in subsidies, either subsidies to gain market share in third markets or subsidization of local firms. This is where the action is. And in this, Mexico's outcomes are extremely standard and in line with many other countries. Let's go to slide 21. Please, you can break down which countries are responsible for most of the market access which is at risk, and it shouldn't surprise you that the United States stands out. It is, of course, the biggest destination for Mexico's exports, but other countries are also responsible for growing market access threats. Many of them are other G20 members. Let me put up slide 22, please, and conclude with 3 questions. I think these facts raise 3 questions. The first is, it would be good to understand more about Mexico's approach to trade policy transparency and what steps could be taken to improve that transparency going forward. Secondly, when we look at the developments of Mexican trade policy since the last TPR, the market access improvements appear to have overshadowed the scale of the restrictive measures. And I think the question we want to ask is, with this new, or now not so new administration in Mexico, what development purpose is served by these market access changes? What's the underlying logic, and can we understand its importance? Last question. We seem to have found that Mexico's harmful trade policies have disproportionately affected LDC exports. I'm quite sure this was not by design, but I do wonder whether or not Mexico could take steps to design its commercial policies in such a way as to avoid less harm to lower per capita income countries. So I put these questions on the table for potential discussion as we go forward. Thank you very much for your time, and apologies for the snafu at the beginning. As Clem said, I'm trying to master a new laptop, and I'm quite sure at the moment I'm the servant and it is the master. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. I think it's worth noting, by the way, that Simon, supported by the Swiss government, is presenting a similar set of talks to lesser developed countries on the trade policies of G20 members as they approach their trade policy reviews. So this question that Simon has now raised of a disproportionate impact of measures on lesser developed countries, LDCs, may well come very much to has been brought to the attention of a number of LDCs already, and may well enliven the trade policy review debate when it comes up in the WTO in early October. That is the hope, I think, and that is what will make the TPR more valuable to the whole process. I hope that this process itself also enlivens that debate. Fernando, I'm not going to introduce questions at this particular point, but I hope you're storing them up, in particular the relatively low amount of information that is available from Mexico. But Fernando, perhaps you might be able to pick up on that in your intervention. Fernando is a former Mexican ambassador to the WTO and now a professor at a university in Mexico City. Fernando, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here, seeing so many friendly faces, and really is wonderful. Let me just try to share my screen if I can find, okay, here. For some reason, I'm unable to do it. Can you pass me the controller? No. Okay, here it is, I believe.
You're on the screen, Fernando, yeah.
Okay, very good. So let me see if I can do it even better. Okay, so let me start with providing a view of what Mexico has been doing during this past years on. I'm not going to enter into the discussion if we're going to be into a deglobalization process or not. I'm just showing here that for Mexico, we have continued to grow in the trade in relation to our GDP. Of course, this is a ratio, so you can find here that even in 2000, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I could manage. Okay, here we are. So here you can see that even in 2020, there was some kind of an increase in the ratio of trade to GDP, but that was because GDP went down much more than trade. And here, what you can see is that we have the highest rate in foreign value added in Mexico's exports are among the highest in OECD. It increased from 32.3 in 2011 to 36.4 in 2016, and this is a huge increase. So this means that Mexico continues to be becoming even more integrated to the world economy. And of course, the exports have been the driver of growth in Mexico during the past many years, particularly during the past 5 years. Of course, the left-hand side of the graph is not comparable with the right-hand side of the graph because, the GDP, of course, is 3 times as big as exports. But you can see here the trend, and you can see, and as was mentioned by Simon, that Mexico's exports have continued to grow, and that, of course, to the surprise of many, including me, and maybe against the instincts of the current administration, we have been very well behaved in introducing trade restrictive measures, except for the ones that were mentioned by Simon and the ones that I will show at a later stage. And one of the things that is quite important is that there is a ménage à trois between or among Mexico, China, and the U.S. During the time of it continues to be of the trade war between Mexico and between China and the United States, what everybody said was there was going to be a nearshoring of many of the operations that the U.S. the American transnationals would bring to Mexico. It was the best candidate because of the geographical situation and because of the NAFTA, now USMCA, and that would provide Mexico with the opportunity of fastly increasing its exports. And the ménage à trois is because Mexico imports. Let me put it this way: when John and Jonathan and myself were negotiating the NAFTA, 70% of total imports of Mexico came from the United States. Right now, it's only like 43%. And in the 90s, only 3% of Mexico's imports came from China. Now it's 20%, and most of them there are inputs that are used by Mexican producers to export to the U.S. And again, well, what we have to see is if Mexico has become really there's been a big process of nearshoring into Mexico. This Greenfield FDA, that of course is FDA, that the new foreign direct investment is it doesn't cover reinvestment in the countries. You can see that Mexico has not been very much let's put it some way mild. Has not been very active in the nearshoring process, though there are a number of programs by the government to try to do it. And there's been a conflicting data about if there's been an increasing process of nearshoring or not. Now, there was this source this survey by the central bank, and according to this, 20% of in the northern region, 20% of companies that were interviewed said that the demand due to nearshoring has increased for them. Whereas in the rest of the country, particularly in the southern part, that is not an exporter region of Mexico, most of exports are concentrated in the north and the center of Mexico. And you can see here that, well, it seems that is working. However, if you look at studies made by both Kenny and Union de Banque Suisse, what they show is that it's the Asian ASEAN countries plus Korea plus Chinese Taipei, the ones that have more benefited from from the situation, and now that the possibilities of moving goods across the Pacific have much more benefited than Mexico has. And let me now, if I can move. What are the main, as you asked me, Clem, I went to the private sector and started asking what are the main complaints they have about Mexico's trade policy. And the general complaint is that there is little respect of the rule of law. And this is violating, of course, our trade agreements, and this is producing establishing obstacles for the nearshoring process. So the current administration is very much interested in oil and gas and electricity. That's their main concern. And they are spending a lot of money in new refineries and in modernizing the old ones and in providing money to the electricity company that's a state-owned company, and they are taking measures to favor both the Pemex and the oil company and CFE, the electricity company. So this has brought with it a number of these encounters with the U.S. and also with Canada. So much so that there has been a consultation process, ongoing consultation process, under the dispute settlement mechanism in the USMCA. And just to put it very, very in a very resumed way, what the US and Canada are complaining about is that there is a prioritization of the distribution of the CFE generated power. And this means that the CFE will take its own electricity, even if it's more expensive, and this is something that is not included in the current law. They use their own electricity first, and then they allow the providers of particularly solar powered and wind powered electricity as a backup, not the other way out, and as the law asks for. The second one is the delays, denials, revocations of foreign companies' abilities to operate in Mexico's energy sector. For instance, not providing or not renewing permits to provide electricity, or taking a long time in providing the permits. So there is being a lot of delays in the authorization for the provision of electricity by the private sector. Another one is the granting of only to Pemex of an extension to comply with the maximum sulfur content in diesel. The first two are, of course, directly related to the USMCA. This one is also related to WTO, because national treatment is denied to the foreign providers of diesel. And the last one is the provision of advantages to Pemex and the electricity company to move their products across national transportation networks, the oil pipes and gas pipes. And this is also something that the US and Canada have been complaining. The consultation period is almost over, and sometime, we don't know when, and that will very much depend on domestic politics in the US. We do not know if there's going to be, of course, an agreement. I don't believe so, but maybe. And also when a panel is established. And most of the private sector, not all of it, but most of the private sector supports the US and Canada complaints, and this is for two reasons. The first one is the price of electricity in Mexico is much higher than in the US and Canada. And this, and of course, this provides a disadvantage to the Mexican companies using electricity. And the second one is that if Mexico loses a panel and the government refuses to comply with the rulings, then there is going to be a retaliation. And the most important part of it is that, in this part of the world, we have been using very often the carousel provision of retaliatory measures. You start with one sector and then you move to the other, and so on. And there's been many figures thrown into the air to how much that would be. And for some reason, $13,000 have stuck in the public opinion, and it's like 8% of total exports of Mexico. The other thing is the backtracking on trade facilitation. All these procedures and asking of new documentation and asking of different kinds of information and then changing in the formats and so on has been a common currency during the past few years. And the problem is that delays very much all the processes related to customs, and of course to the clearance of merchandise coming into the country. Long time to get a response for each operation, increasing uncertainty of getting an authorization, e-paperwork increasing with the stated purpose of reducing smuggling, but what the private sector says that what has increased is the number and the amount of fines derived from mistakes in the filling forms. And what has happened is that there's been an increase, of course, in the income of the government income from these operations. And though we have made clear, we as Mexico, that we would have ready the single window a long time ago, according to the private sector, there's still like 20% of the trade-related requirements outside the single window. There has been a disappearance of institutions devoted to promote the foreign trade exports and foreign direct investment. And well, the good news is that, as Simon mentioned, the government has not used trade as the main lever to an industrial policy that was announced yesterday, and so that we can start providing more resources to 5 different sectors. And another element is that, of course, as we haven't been using tariffs as an instrument of industrial policy, well, there's basically no change in the average tariff in Mexico since the last trade policy review. Let me try to ask some of the questions by Simon. Then, first, the threshold for investment that you require to go beyond it to report an operation. Well, this has very much to do with what Jonathan and John did in the NAFTA, and they said, particularly Jonathan, when he was and doing all the legal scrubbing, set a number in when people should start providing or going to asking for reporting the investment made in Mexico. The second one, I'm not surprised that the LDCs are most affected. I'm not surprised, but because clothing and shoes have been traditionally one of the most protected sectors in Mexico. And they did it again like 2 years ago when they suspended a plan. The government suspended a plan of liberalizing trade in clothes and shoes, and that's why you can see an increase in that sector. And then, of course, particularly coffee, we also have been. It has also been a traditional sector which we have been protecting because it's produced in the southern part of the country, and trade policy continues to be very much used for this kind of sectors. And of course, fuels has very much to do with what the current administration is trying to revive in the Mexican economy. Just remember that in the beginning of the 80s, oil represented 80% of our exports. Nowadays is like 7%, 8% of our total exports. And trade policy transparency. This is one of the issues that the private sector has been dealing with, or at least this is what they told me. That the problem is that they have been changing all the different the documentations for imports and exports without, though they follow the procedures, but they're doing it very, very often. So here, what the problem is that the burden has been changed from the public sector, from government officials, to the private sector. The private sector has to do the work that used to be done by government officials. So I'll leave it here, and thank you very much.
Fernando, thank you very much indeed, and in particular for your comments about the views of the private sector. That's very valuable. I'd asked you to do that, and thank you again for doing it. Can you, yeah. I'm trying to see people on the screen. You fully have your share screen on.
There you are.
There we are.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Fernando. We're now going to go to Bradley Condon, who is the chairholder in Mexico. The WTO has a chairs program, and the head of that chairs program in the WTO, Werner Duck, is here with us today. The chairholder in Mexico is Bradley. He's at ITAM University. One of the pillars of the chairs is outreach, which means that they stay in touch with the community at large to make them more familiar with the with the workings of the WTO, but also for them to understand what the community at large thinks about the WTO and about trade policy of the country that they're in. So Bradley is in a particularly good position, I think, as chair, to contribute to this discussion with his views on Mexico's trade policy. Bradley, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Clem, and thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. I think I'm going to focus my comments today on, first of all, dispute settlement, and secondly, next generation regional trade agreements, and finally looking at, in particular, what's happening on the ground with respect to gender provisions in trade agreements. But I'll start by talking a bit about the context. I looked through Simon's slides and Fernando's slides, and I think that they paint a picture, a very interesting picture about the relationship between regional trade agreements and the WTO for Mexican trade policy. From Simon, that the threats to market access are overwhelmingly from the United States in first place and Canada in a distant second place, and that Mexico's exports to RTA partners are over 95% and imports over 78%. Those paint a picture of why trade access is not such a big issue for Mexico when it comes to the WTO. And I remember Fernando saying this to me about 15 years ago, if I remember correctly, how many years has passed, that Mexico's interest in the WTO is really more systemic because most of its trade is covered by RTAs. And so I remember when Fernando said that to me, it really got me thinking about, okay, well, what does that mean, systemic interest? And thinking about that, I think one of the issues that comes to mind is dispute settlement. And of course, under the NAFTA, the state-to-state dispute settlement system under Chapter 20 broke down. We now have a new replacement for that in the USMCA CUSMA TMEC. And I think an interesting question is, what's going to happen now? How important is WTO dispute settlement for Mexico when it doesn't seem to be working as well as it used to? And when we have a new NAFTA that has a dispute settlement mechanism that may work better than the old one. So in terms of which one has the better dispute settlement system, I think it's up in the air now with the changes that have happened in both systems. What are the implications for Mexican trade policy? Fernando talked about the disputes that are happening now, and one of the issues is going to be, is the Mexican government going to comply with the rulings of the panels? But I suppose an even more interesting question is whether the United States is going to comply, because it was the United States that really torpedoed the old system under the NAFTA. So I think the whole question of how dispute settlement is going to work is very much up in the air, both in the multilateral system and in the regional system that is most important for Mexico. Moving on to next generation RTAs. The new RTAs are increasing quite a lot provisions regarding the environment, regarding labor, regarding gender, and of course, have a lot of TRIPS plus provisions. But it gets complicated. Of course, this is one of the big arguments traditionally in favor of the WTO and the multilateral system, is that if you have all this spaghetti bowl of RTAs, then it's going to make it difficult to sort out what the rules are. And that's going to be a problem, not just for the private sector, but also for the government in terms of how it's going to shape its trade policy in light of all of those agreements. If we look at gender in particular, I have a very distinguished co-chair at the WTO Chair at ETAM, Professor Amrita Vari, and she has been doing some excellent work with respect to gender and trade. She's been extraordinarily productive both with her publications and with her outreach on this topic. And she provided me with some information for the talk today because she couldn't be here. And before I mention this, I just want to say that gender equality is not just relevant for gender equality and economic growth and justice. It's also very relevant for climate change, because there's a direct link between gender equality and the capacity to address climate change. So Amrita gave me some figures here. Out of Mexico's 23 RTAs, 19 have no gender provisions, and there are 10 that have really indirect references that are not explicitly about gender, and only 3 that have explicit gender provisions: the EU-Mexico Agreement, the USMCA, and the CPTPP. And it's the last 2 that have the most ambitious agenda with respect to gender equality. But she says the big question is what actions will follow on the ground. In Mexico, there's been no appointment of contact points or a dedicated unit for gender equality, so implementation is lacking. But she points out that there is a growing appetite in Mexican politics to use trade instruments as a means to further women's empowerment. So I think the gender issue is a really good example of how you need to have greater implementation on the ground of these specific next generation provisions in trade agreements. And I would say the same question arises for climate change provisions. We don't have much in the way of climate change provisions in the USMCA, but in the EU-Mexico agreement, there are quite a lot. And in this CPTPP, we have more as well. So the question is, how will these play out on the ground? And of course, when we look at all of these next generation RTAs, it raises the question of to what extent can the WTO move forward in negotiations and start addressing some of these issues more effectively as well. And this takes me back to where I began with Fernando's comment 15 years ago that Mexico has a systemic interest in the WTO. And one of the thoughts that that conversation provoked for me was the relationship between negotiation failure and the failure of the dispute settlement system. Because the way I see it, if you can't have successful negotiations to provide official interpretations or to provide advances in WTO law, then the appellate body, of course, was going to take on more and more of the task and overstep their bounds. And that's exactly what happened. And that's what has ended up causing so much trouble with the dispute settlement system there. So really, Mexico has benefited a lot from the dispute settlement system at the WTO. It's benefited a lot from trade. Looking at Fernando's slide on the percentage of trade to GDP and how that has grown over the years, it made me think about what you see on the ground in Mexico. The country has transformed since the 1980s, but in particular in the last 25 years, it has become a solidly middle-class country in so many ways. When you're in Mexico City, you really see that on the ground. It's really, the transformation has been extraordinary. And I always like to talk to my students about what it was like in the early 1980s in Mexico, when you couldn't get a telephone line. And if you wanted to make a phone call, you could try many, many times and the call would not go through. I developed a policy of maximum 10 attempts at a phone call per day. And if it didn't work, I'd try again the next day. And it would take years to get a phone line. Another example from 1983 is we ran out of toothpaste in Mexico in 1983. It's pretty extraordinary to think that a whole country would be without toothpaste. Those things don't happen anymore. Yes, we've had some supply chains disruptions with the pandemic, but when I tell my students this, they can hardly believe it. They're so shocked that they stop looking at their cell phones. I mean, now we have this extraordinary coverage of telecommunication services, and there was a dispute about that, as you all know, between Mexico and the United States. So trade has transformed Mexico, and I think it's going to continue to transform Mexico. And there is a big question about how this government is going to handle Mexico's trade policy and how effectively it's going to do so. And there, what I keep hearing from former students and other friends that have worked in the government is that a lot of people have left the government. A lot of the most talented people working in trade in the government have left because the new administration has reduced benefits and reduced salaries, and also imposed restrictions on where you can work when you leave the government. So that has really lowered the level of expertise. And I'm just going to end with an anecdote. One of my students came to me, was waiting outside my classroom one day because he works at a law firm that does administrative law. And they were handling some administrative law aspects of an investment dispute involving, of course, the energy sector. And he came to me and he said, well, in the government office that normally handles these disputes, they don't have anybody anymore who knows how to do it. And so they've asked my firm to handle the investment dispute as well as the administrative law dispute. But we don't know how to handle it either. And so I gave him a quick half an hour summary of investment law and an explanation of the main provisions in the dispute. And I suggested that he needed to go and hire an expert. But those kinds of stories that I've been hearing are very troubling in terms of how capable the government is going to be of handling its trade policy and its investment policy in the future. So I think I'll end there, and let me end by saying thank you again for the invitation, and say how happy I am to see so many friendly faces and so many familiar faces from Geneva and from elsewhere. I remember seeing Jonathan Fried speak about the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in Washington back in the 1980s. And so it's nice to see you again. So thank you very much.
Bradley, thank you very much. I'm a bit surprised you can remember back 40 years to the toothpaste shortage. As we go on, I'm going to ask Willie to say a few words. Willie is the Director of Trade Policy Review in the WTO, and it is in support of that mechanism that we hold these trade policy previews as well. So I'm going to ask Willie to say a word or two if he wishes. Willie, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Clement. I'm very happy to take part in this session surrounded by real trade experts with such a long experience. So I feel young among the group, not in terms of age, of course, but in terms of the experience. You know, this trade policy preview, I find it extremely useful, very useful. I would only hope that we could do this whenever we are starting to work on the DPR of a country, because it could give us some excellent ideas to dig more from our side, because it comes at a time when the reports are done, they are finished. From our side, maybe we have missed some elements, but anyway, it's really very interesting. As you know, I cannot reveal the contents of the Trade Policy Review report itself, but I can share with you some broad elements that we notice this time working for the Trade Policy Review of Mexico. Beyond the details of things that may have happened since the previous review, what we noted is that there's a new approach to trade and economic policy, and in particular to state involvement. And that's something that is reflected in the report with a great deal of details. And that may explain this new approach, why there's such a great interest in the forthcoming Trade Policy Review of Mexico in terms of members' participation. We have more than 30 delegations that have requested to take part in the meeting, and we have received what I believe is a record number of advanced questions. And these questions will certainly indicate the areas of particular concerns to members regarding Mexico's trade policies and the changes that have occurred since the previous one. These questions draw also from inputs from the private sector, and I'm very happy that Fernando referred to some of these areas. So all in all, I believe that this trade policy review of Mexico will not be the same as the previous one. First of all, increase the level of participation of members, more questions, maybe an interest on certain sectors. In the interventions, the 3 interventions which were very excellent, some of them refer to certain sectors where members may have a keen interest, energy, for example, or electricity, and Fernando referred to these elements. So I believe that this discussion is extremely useful to be complemented with this, the review by the members, in particular through the advanced written questions. I believe that the value of this exercise comes also from this exchange of questions and the replies that Mexico will have to provide. One final point, and I think that Fernando already referred it, and is one point that Simon noted in his very, very pertinent presentation, is the fact that LDCs would seem to be disproportionately affected by Mexico's trade measures. From what we have observed during the TPRs, we have not found a particular measure that specifically target this group of countries. What may be the case is that Mexico is taking measures in certain sectors, such as clothing, and Fernando referred to that, where LDCs have a higher export interest. So that may explain this finding by Sam. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Clem, and back to you.
Willie, thank you very much. And thank you for the suggestion that we might want to hold these a little earlier in the trade policy review process. I think we need to think about that. We would need to be in touch with you, however, for your plans. We would need to know that a little bit in advance, but it's a potentially a good idea, and we will certainly think about that. Also, I think your point about product composition and LDC involved about the LDC story is probably pertinent. John, you've both been mentioned as having past involvement with Mexico, particularly in the free trade agreement process. Do either of you wish to say anything? Don't both jump at the same time. Jonathan?
Yeah, I have my hand raised. So first, with thanks to Fernando and Simon and Willie, very comprehensive as one would expect, and I'm delighted to renew my studies under these masters of WTO and related issues. But let me pose a question to all of you because it wasn't highlighted in the presentation. And that is that in addition to the energy policies, the other dimension, the other sector that's getting a lot of publicity and poses quite a range of challenges is agriculture. And in particular, the fact that the current administration in Mexico has declared its intention to seek a GMO-free country. It's being very strict, even more so than Europe, on SPS-related measures and restrictions. This has come up in the CUSMA USMCA TMEC Trade Commission, and maybe on the verge of another dispute settlement panel, but it poses, and I'm not sure, Simon, how you account for this, it poses the question that plagues us on trade, environment, and social choice as to whether such measures are considered restrictive or within the zone of policy choice that one might argue is left to member countries. And I gather that in Mexico, it's also generated a range of domestic reactions from the farmers through to the processors, through to the consuming industries, if not public. I just find it a fascinating, very current issue that has potentially global implications. So I just throw that out in light of the fact that we're a bit short of time, and if any of you would wish to comment on that. But again, thank you all for a very rich discussion so far.
Jonathan, thank you very much. John, you too have your hand up. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This has been an excellent presentation, and in the interest of time, I'll sort of cut to the heart of what I would like to say, and that is, the point has been made very well that Mexican trade is principally with its free trade partners, and that therefore perhaps the WTO is really only of systemic interest to Mexico. And I would like to say, I think one of the things you have to look at when and perhaps this is going back to my experience with the Committee on Regional Trade Agreements. Willie, it's very nice to see you on this show today. Where we were focusing on systemic issues. And one thing I think it would be useful to look at during trade policy reviews would be to what extent, if the country like Mexico, for instance, is heavily dependent on its free trade agreement partners and the provisions in the free trade agreements, to what extent is the WTO relevant in a real policy sense on specific issues? And for instance, I think it would be for Mexico in the area of subsidies and countervailing measures, and in the area of anti-dumping, because these are two very significant areas where, frankly, the USMCA does not have substantive obligations of any real meaningful nature. So, and I would note that these are, in terms of Simon's list, these are particularly in the area of subsidies. This is something that's been identified as an area contributing to distortions, and where clearly the WTO provisions would frankly be more relevant than the FTA provisions in the USMCA. So I'll stop there in the interest of giving people an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, John, and thank you for raising the matter of subsidies. Mercedes, your hand is up. You're next.
Sorry, I don't turn on my camera. I have an accident, so my face looks horrible.
Oh, come on.
It was in New York, a scooter hit me.
A scooter hit you? You're
yeah,
okay.
horrible. Well, I really appreciate this evaluation of the trade policy review, because it's, as right now in Latin America, we're going through this wave of populism in many countries. So Mexico was a very interesting example for many countries like mine when we started with our policy review, because Mexico started with its policies during the 90s, and after that, many of us follow Mexico, and Fernando is one of our advisors at that time. So right now we see that they are going backwards in many of the policies that we share as a view, for example, in the regional arrangement that we have on the Pacific Alliance, for example. And we see all the countries in the Pacific Alliance moving in such kind of direction right now. And so what is going on in Mexico is interesting for us a lot. So we may follow that path, and that's something that's worrying for many of us. That I would like to think also this kind of nationalism is coming through the energy industry, but may come also in the agricultural sector with policies that may address more protectionism. For example, in my country, they start talking about a new agricultural reform based on this kind of populist protectionist policies. And that's something that is making me feel worried. On the other side, the issues that are getting, as Bradley mentioned, and it's very important, is the issues that on the newer RTAs, we are seeing more and more the issues of social and environmental issues. In the case of Peru, we were the first one to sign, I happened to me, an issue very particularly with the US on forestry, for example, on these issues on environment were very strict and difficult to apply. And the commitment should be a long-term process, and it's very difficult to apply because every time we have a change of government, people forgot what we signed. And it's very difficult to be able to implement, not only implement it, it's also to really commit and keep the commitments on track. And so environmental, gender, or any other issues there are difficult to implement. Sometimes we face difficulties because we have a very large informal sector in those areas. And so we have to be very careful what we impose there through these issues. So I think market access could be difficult after that we have signed that, but at the same time, we need the cooperation to complement that. Probably what we had similarly with the European Union was an agreement that was a little lighter, but also had more cooperation involved in that. So I would see that an issue should be addressed. And yes, I'm worried about the anti-dumping issues that are not in the RTAs in general. And anti-dumping is an instrument that is most used basically with countries that are in the same level of development, not with the big ones. So that's an issue we should take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. We are beginning to run rather short of time. I'm going to put a stop to the interventions now, except that I think it'd be a good idea and appropriate for Elisa to say a few words and then to go back to the three speakers. Elisa Almeida, the Mexican delegate.
Thank you so much, Clem, and thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me. So thank you for this invitation. I echo the remarks that this is a very good exercise, a previous exercise to the TPR. It has been very insightful. So first of all, thank you to all the presenters, particularly to my former boss, although I did miss a little bit of his presentation because my computer crashed. Nothing personal, Fernando. But it's always a pleasure to learn from this masters, and it's good to see all the friendly faces and former ambassadors that I've been able to meet throughout the years here in WTO. First, as I said, this is very insightful. I won't attempt to answer all the questions, but I do have some comments that maybe could help. First of all, there has been some mentions of the value we have in multilateralism and in WTO, and I would confirm that we value regionalism, and that's why we have so many FTAs, and we have a vast and growing network of it. With new generation ones. But for us, it is true that the underpinning of all this is still the multilateral trading system in the WTO. So we do see our systemic concerns as a very valid, very true, and we work on them. And that has been our main focus here in WTO, making sure that we have an organization that works, that is fully functional, and that's why we do participate right now in the different processes to get the appellate body up and running again, and also to get the negotiation arm running and being a bit more effective than what has happened lately. So another comment is, yes, trade has transformed Mexico in many ways, and it will keep on transforming it. We are an open economy, and we will keep on being an open economy. Our interventions is good to see that what Simon mentioned, that it balances out what we do. So we do have had some unilateral measures that might have hurt some, but in the end of the day, it balances out. And on that note, and his question of LDCs, I fully agree with what Willie said. So it is not intentional. It has never been intentional to hurt particular LDCs, but the measures have focused in some of the sectors that some bigger LDCs have a bigger advantage or have more trade. So it could be because of it. Thinking several Asian LDCs that might have a little bit more access to the market and have been sadly impacted by this. We do have many challenges, as pointed out by Fernando de Mateo, and I won't even start to answer those, but I will certainly convey them to here to the government and try to see what we can do to address if they come up here in WTO in our TPR review. And yes, talented people have left, but it's still, it's a sobering remark, this, what has been said. But despite the shortcomings, we're thinking that could be temporary. And because of the involvement that we've always had in trade, there will always be an interest on keeping people that are prepared and that are willing to learn more. Might take us a little bit of time, but we're still there with the help of Fernando and his diplomado and his and the effort that he's doing of training more people. We might get even better options right now with people being better prepared. And just the last remark on the last speaker on agriculture, and we do recognize that there are challenges, but however, for us in agriculture, and me being an agriculture attaché, I feel obliged to say something on it, is we recognize we're a net exporter. And we've always valued that and we've worked towards it. But now this government has also recognized that there are some people that have been set aside. So the marginalized and poor farmers are now the full objective of our help and our subsidies. So we want to make sure that if they don't have access to international trade, they do have access to better incomes. So all on that, I think we are really running out of time. So thank you so much for all this. It has been very insightful, very good exchange, food for thought, and I'm sure that we will try to address many of these concerns in our TPR in the next week. Following week, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. Elisa, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go back now to the three speakers, and I'm going to start with you, Bradley. Perhaps you might think a bit about Mercedes's point of populism, nationalism, and from your point as the chair, as a matter of fact, with contacts.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I found Mercedes' comments quite interesting. Yeah. And in particular, she was talking about how changes in government staffs makes it difficult to maintain the expertise, because the people who know what they're supposed to do, under the example of forestry that she gave, leave and new ones come in, and they don't know how things operate. And that makes me think about the different programs that the WTO has. So for example, you have regional trade policy courses, and I participated in those for many years for Latin America. And one of the comments that would come up is that because you have this turnover in the government, the people that attend the trade policy courses, they end up leaving the government and they take the expertise with them. And so there's this constant loss and turnover of people. And I think that's perhaps a selling point for the WTO Chair program, because we're here long term. There isn't a big turnover in the WTO chairs. And we're there to keep, and not just the WTO chairs, but other professors as well who are not WTO chairs, who are even more distinguished than I am. Fernando is who I'm thinking of there, who is preparing generation after generation of expertise. So turnover is a natural part, and so one has to think about how you maintain that level of expertise. And I think that is also relevant to what Elisa said about people leaving the government and finding ways to train the incoming ones again. So in terms of what Elisa said about marginalized and poor farmers, I think that's actually quite relevant to the point that Jonathan Fried made about the GMO policy, because with climate change, it's particularly the marginalized and poor farmers that are going to need access to GMO technology that makes crops more resilient to climate change. And that's also related to the point I made about provisions in RTAs of TRIPS Plus, because one of the unfortunate things that's been happening is you have countries signing on to the 1991 UPOV Convention, and it's a lot less favorable to flexible policy making with respect to new plant varieties. And the WTO law there, in my view, is much better than the RTA law. But unfortunately, once you get that into the RTAs, you apply MFN and it gets generalized. So I think that's a real problem. And in terms of what John Weeks said about the systemic importance, I think that's a very good point about the subsidies and the CVDs and the anti-dumping duties in terms of there not being any substantive law in the USMCA or the previous NAFTA. But also I think WTO jurisprudence has always been relevant to dispute settlement under regional trade agreements because it incorporates so many provisions from the WTO agreements. And that's another reason why I think it's so important to look at where is the best place to settle disputes. And it's important to have a strong multilateral dispute settlement mechanism in place because the jurisprudence is extremely important for the law. Well, there are many more comments I could make, but I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Bradley, thank you very much indeed. Simon, may I turn to you for a few minutes, and then Fernando for you to wind up. Simon?
Thank you, Clem. I'll make three short comments. So with respect to agriculture, of course, SPS is very important, but in our calculations, the ones I shared with you today, we do not include the SPS measures in there because we never wanted our calculations to be disputed because they might confuse legitimate SPS measures with other types of trade measures. So we have always kept them apart. What I can tell you is that looking back since the last TPR, about 31% of Mexican agricultural imports have benefited from some type of reform, mainly changes in import tariff quotas, and 28% have faced new trade barriers. So that's without the SPS. There's a lot of action going on, which suggests that Jonathan's intuition is correct. Second, with respect to John Weeks, comment is absolutely right. Subsidies are a key factor affecting overseas export performance of Mexico. I think our slide 20 nails that point, showing exactly the export shares. And it's not just subsidies to local firms, import competing firms that matter, it's also export incentives of different types, normally through tax systems. Third and last comment is the disproportionate exposure of LDC exports to Mexican measures is almost certainly a function of product or sectoral composition. That comes through very clearly on our slide 16. It is not a function of specific targeting of LDCs. And I think I was very careful in my presentation not to use the T word and just to highlight the fallout. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.
Simon, thank you very, very much indeed. Fernando, you have the last word.
That's great, having the last word. Let me first answer some of the comments that have been made. Mexico was where the Green Revolution started in the 50s. So many here in Mexico think that it's very unfortunate that we are becoming a free or GMO-free country, and particularly what was mentioned by Elisa, and she didn't mention GMO, but she mentioned about poor farmers, and there were also Bradley when he mentioned that poor farmers are the ones that suffer most by the climate change. And so here, of course, there is going to be a big dispute with our neighbors to the north, and inside Mexico, of course, the pork and beef growers are pig. No, pork is when it's dead. The pig is when it's alive. So the pig growers and the beef growers, they are not very happy with that. what John mentioned, yes, of course. I mean, it's more for the WTO than, or you could deal it better with WTO in the WTO than in USMCA. Problem is that we are having some problems with WTO dispute settlement mechanism. Mercedes, I don't see her anymore, but I don't know. Yes, you are there. There you are. How are you, Mercedes? Very nice seeing you. Not seeing you, but hearing from you. Let me mention about the one social issue that has not been mentioned during this discussion, and this is the rapid response mechanism for labor subjects between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. And this would, I could devote 1 hour to discussing this, but let me just say that already there have been 5 issues because, or 5 cases between Mexico and the U.S. on labor dispute settlement. It's a different dispute settlement than the one applied to goods and services. Is a one that is much more stringent, the one that is much more shorter, and so here is something that will continue to happen not only with Mexico but with the agreements among developed and developing countries, or among the different countries. So here I also would like to mention anti-dumping. Anti-dumping, thanks to Canada, we continue to have the anti-dumping mechanism that we had in the NAFTA. At the end, Mexico said, okay, if you don't like it, US, we would not object. But then Canada came and said, no, either we have this chapter in the agreement or there is no agreement. So just let me say that I really congratulate you, Lou, Clem, Simon, for having this kind of events. They are really very, very helpful. They are very helpful for the government officials, as Elisa that is here, and really I miss her very much. But it's also helpful for other people because as we do not have access to the WTO information, or the report written by the Secretariat is quite more complicated and easy at the same time to try to find out what is going on in the different countries in trade policy. And I must say that, again, to conclude, that to my big surprise, Mexico, during the current administration that is, as was mentioned by Bradley, there are many elements that are not playing in favor of economic growth, but at the same time, in trade policy, for some reason, Mexico has continued to follow an open trade policy and has not used it except for in energy and in some sectors in ag for a trade policy and for industrial policy or agricultural policy purposes. So that is a very good news for the development of Mexico, because again, the only motor, the only engine that is moving now in Mexico is exports. And that is what has provided us with certain increase in the GDP of the country.
Fernando, thank you very much indeed. And that we are now out of time, so we have to wind up. I want to thank in particular Simon, Fernando, and Bradley for your wonderful contributions, and to all of you for being here and attending this TPP. Thank you and good night. Goodbye.
Buenos dias. It's very early in the morning here in Mexico.
Yeah, I know. I said good night. I shouldn't have said that. Have a good day, Brad.
Buen dia, buen dia.
Usually in the time I was brushing my teeth.
Natalie, you can close up shop.